Good evening, morning. I am back once again. Did you guys know this was going to be the show? Do you guys remember this show? This was a show that uh, I originally wanted to do with Jean Bajlan, but for whatever reason, he couldn't make it. Or told me, just get Excander. He's the expert on these matters. But Excander had recommended a book on social media. We're all social media friends, and the book seemed pretty interesting. He reached out to the author of the book for me, Afshin, who's on the show. I reached out to Afshin, and Afshin was like, I'll do the show, but I'll only do the show if these people could be on the show with me. So if you watch the show, there's some people that didn't like the fact that these guys were all scholars and being somewhat congratulatory in the early parts of the show. They hadn't been talking like this outside of like email, so to see each other on a screen like this was kind of a good feeling. And they did respect each other's work quite a bit, and the work I think is important. And if you watch the show, there's a lot of grappling with things like the legacy of Mossadegh. And also this show happened before there was a war in Iran. There were tensions. Everyone was definitely afraid of what could happen. But the worst, I guess you could say, has happened in Iran. And this was a show that maybe 2 months before everything blew off, we recorded this. But wherever you're watching or later listening to the show, there still is a link in the description to Afshin's book, which I think is a pretty important read if you want to understand the U.S.'s role, like really understand outside of just Mossadegh and what many think they know about the Shah or the revolution. I mean, you have two guys on the screen that were literally a part of that revolution. So, again, I think this is one of the more poignant shows we've done in the 7 years of doing this. I hate to say the word blessed, but I feel blessed sometimes, I guess, if that's the right way to put it, to be able to make some of these connections and make these kinds of things happen. If you do appreciate the kinds of programming that we do provide here on TIR, and you do appreciate a lot of the writing that we do here on TIR, like the weekly newsletter, there's been quite a few more crisis papers, considering we're at 21. I think I started it like a little over a year ago, maybe even 2 years ago. I have to see when the first one was. Trying to set aside more time to do more serious writing, which is a reason why I'm literally not here live with you guys, because we're discussing my more serious writing. But if you do appreciate all this, wherever you're watching or later listening to the show, become a patron. And if you are not down with Patreon and you listen on Apple, you can become a paid subscriber and get access to the champagne rooms that we do provide on Apple as well. That being said, I will move out of the way for a very great discussion. And if you watch the show, I try to move out of the way as much as possible. This is not necessarily a space that I am well versed in. So I, like you guys, got to sit back and listen. So sit back, listen, enjoy the show. And we are, or at least I am, can see you guys later, place the history of U.S. and Iran relations. Today's conversation is happening at a moment when history feels anything but settled. As protests once again spread across Iran, driven by economic collapse, political repression, and deep public exhaustion, the Trump administration has returned to a familiar posture. Open saber rattling, renewed threats, and rhetorical escalation alongside Israel, all framed as necessary responses to instability inside Iran. As the recent events make clear, this posture does not exist outside Iran's internal crisis. It actively shapes it, narrowing political space while empowering the most authoritarian voices within the Iranian state. This is the backdrop against which we're discussing Axis of Empire, a history of Iran-U.S. relations, by our guest today, Afshin Matin-Asgari, a book that insists we stop treating U.S.-Iran hostility as the product of misunderstanding, cultural incapability, or ideological extremism. and instead confront it as the result of imperial power exercised over time. Early in the book, Asghari rejects the comforting myth that U.S. involvement in Iran began with good intentions gone wrong. He writes that the history of U.S.-Iran relations has been shaped not by misperception or tragedy, but by power. Quote, drawing on a massive body of historical evidence, this book shows that throughout the 20th century and all the way to the present, American policy towards Iran invariably has been shaped by imperial priorities, unquote. That framework matters because it forces us to re-examine one of the most consequential moments in modern Iranian history, the 1953 overthrow of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, a coup still routinely explained in Cold War terms as a necessary response to a looming communist threat. But as Axis of Empire demonstrates, communism was not the central concern, oil was. Iran's attempt to nationalize its petroleum industry threatened British control over Iranian resources and challenged the broader Western order that treated Iran as a semi-colonial space. The US intervention that followed was less about ideology than about enforcing a global system in which resource sovereignty by the global South was unacceptable. Understanding that history is not an academic exercise. US threats and Israeli escalation do not weaken authoritarianism in Iran, they strengthen it. The same imperial logic that shaped the 1953 coup continues to structure how external power interacts with internal dissent. Axis of Empire gives us the tools to understand that continuity. Now, let's introduce our power panel of OGs. We'll start it off with a returning guest. You know him as Jean Bajlam's boy, his homeboy, Ex-Kander.
How's it going?
Thank you for kind of putting this together. This is because I messaged you and you were like, "Oh, I know these people. I can put this together." And I was like, "Oh, thank you so much."
Pleasure.
Because Gene is very difficult now.
I'm sure you can coax him back, you know.
Oh, he comes on, but he tells me when I have these kind of questions, he just tells me to ask you.
Okay. Gene, we miss you, man.
Just ask Ex-Kander. He knows everybody anyway. I'm like, oh, fine, Gene. Well, and also we have joining us, this is a power panel of Iranian professors that understand the history. We have coming all the way live from the very cold East Coast, Hamid Dabashi. Did I get it right?
Almost. That's who. That's fine.
You're getting there.
You're getting better? Dang it. Okay. And the star of the show, the man that wrote the book that we're here to discuss, Afshin Matin-Asgari.
Thank you, Jason. This sounds like a wrestling match.
It's more like it's supposed to be like a rock concert, no? You don't feel like you're at a rock concert? That's what you're supposed to feel like. Well, I want to start off with this question. Why do you reject the idea that U.S.-Iran relations deteriorated because of cultural misunderstanding or mutual mistrust? You kind of start the book off explaining.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't want to be unfairly critical of my colleagues who wrote on U.S.-Iran history within the past 2 or 3 years. Somehow, the topic of U.S.-Iran, obviously there are reasons for it, has become very hot, and a number of academic studies of this have appeared, but none of them almost they don't dispense with what you call this myth of auspicious beginnings or cultural misunderstanding, the assumption that things were okay, but then something went wrong. And they put it at different places. Mostly they put it in 1953.
Mhm.
And as you said, my approach is no, nothing really changed. There was no auspicious beginning. There was no original sin. Um, yeah, I take an imperial framework, and I explain in my introduction that where I come from, I write as a historian of Iran, but also I'm someone who was involved with the anti-imperialist movements of the 1970s in my student days, and that's where I picked up that framework. And again, I say in the book's introduction that my 40 years or so, academic world as a student and as a teacher only really solidified that perspective. Yeah.
I mean,
Uh, what is the question for me?
I didn't know if you wanted to. I didn't know if you wanted to elaborate on what Afshin just said.
Uh, I think, and not just because Afshin is a dear old friend, I've been reading this glorious book that just came out for the past few days when Verso kindly sent me a physical copy. Uh, it is a groundbreaking book for reasons that he just said, precisely because he dispenses with that mythology, that all was hunky-dory, that Baskerville was there and helped with the Constitutional Revolution, and Schuster was there helping with the finances of the Constitutionalists. Wasn't that splendid? And then suddenly we don't know what happened, and then this hostility began. With a very precise historical uh, perspective, Afshin shows that this was just a myth. This doesn't exist. Now, this is no disrespect to my other colleagues who have been talking about this myth, sort of banking on this mythology that the original relationship was splendidly well, but then eventually it went sour. That's also a narrative. But Afshin narrative is more historical and more accurate, not just because it is about US-Iran relationship, but it is also because it is about the US. There's nothing particular about the US relationship with Iran as opposed to Iraq, or as opposed to Turkey, or as opposed to India, etc. It has to do with the internal dynamics
Yeah.
of American imperialism, which now today, 2026, is just open, is naked. Not that there is much difference between Trump and Obama. Obama was just more sleek, liberal imperialist, and so forth. But in the current stage that Trump wants Greenland, Trump wants Venezuela, Trump is changing the map of the universe, including outer space. Afshin's book comes at a time that we begin to rethink the context of American imperialism. Because at the time that people think that US-Iran relationship was all hunky-dory, the British imperialism and the Russian imperialism was particularly powerful. So Iran was throughout the 19th century between the French, the British, and the Russian imperialism. And US was not exactly doing nothing. US was engaged in internal dynamics of internal imperialism, consolidating itself. The significant book of Frederick Jackson Turner, Significant Frontier in American History, is important. How the 13 colonies of 1783 began historically to expansion all the way to the Pacific, and then all the way sort of other wars of conquest, acquisition of Louisiana, etc. Then internal dynamics because of the slavery. So at the time that the British and Russian imperialism was very powerful, US was consolidating its imperial power internally in the Western Hemisphere. So Afshin's book is crucial because it shows us one specific example of how globalization of American imperialism takes place, with a very specific case specific of Iran that I think and I hope and I trust that his book becomes exemplary for us to begin to look in other parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where American imperialism becomes has shadow histories, not just US presidential historians who tell the story of what happens inside the US, but actually competent, caring, visionary historians from other parts of the world begin to retell the story of American imperialism from the perspective of the victims of American imperialism.
And wherever you guys are watching or listening to the show later, there is a link in the description to get Afshin's book, Axis of Empire. Why do you think this this story is kind of mistold, especially after so many books have come out about the 53 coup?
Can I? Are you talking to me?
Sure. Sure, I'm talking to whoever wants to answer.
Yeah. Well, I didn't want to dominate, but Iskandar, you take this.
No, I just wanted to say one thing just about Afshin, if that's okay, just to sort of, which I think is kind of maybe helpful and instructive for the viewers. So, I mean, this is somebody who, as he said, was very much politically active in the 70s, was consistent, was a socialist. He wasn't somebody, as we say in Farsi, Hezb-i-Bad, the party of the, I guess the wind. It blows with the wind, basically, back and forth. He's somebody who's been like really consistent. He was grounded in political struggle, political praxis. He was in Iran during the revolution. He obviously saw that firsthand. This is someone who, and didn't just as a witness, he was somebody who actually wrote for leftist, left-leaning publications, and was in touch with fellow militants. And he's got lots of interesting stories, in that regard, which I've had the honor to obviously listen to and hear over the years. And then obviously this is somebody who subsequently, following the revolution, like many Iranian progressives and leftists and so on, they ended up living, having to leave the country, many in exile, and many obviously didn't make it either. But obviously this is somebody who then subsequently went on, and really his kind of intellectual trajectory is trying to make sense of this experience. And it's something which, as someone who knows him well and thinks of him as a very dear friend and like a mentor, obviously in many ways, you can see a lot of his engagements, such as this book, but obviously multiple books, is a kind of reflection on this, is a grappling with this, is a thinking this through and trying to make sense of this, this sort of like formative, like seismic kind of experience. And I think another thing to add, which is really important, is that obviously then he went subsequently to do this a PhD at UCLA with Nikki Keddie, who's kind of one of the doyens of like modern Iranian history. She was kind of a very notable figure in her own right, and a quite interesting character by all accounts. And he wrote really the seminal book on the Confederation of Iranian Students, which was a radical but sort of very broad-based, like encompassing, the whole spectrum of the whole political spectrum, from Maoists to Marxist-Leninists to sort of nationalists to Islamists as well, right? Really, really broad base, and really kind of a remarkable organization in its own right, which was the foremost important and transnational militant organization opposed to the Shah, the Pahlavi regime, and one that was hounding him in all sorts of ways, and really is kind of intertwined with the history of the global left, and 1968 as well, as this kind of really obviously important kind of moment. And he wrote the seminal book on this organization. This is one which he obviously knew firsthand from the 70s in Iran. And then later, as a historian, he kind of thought through that and reflected on that, and then basically documented it in really important, thrilling detail, and obviously spoke with so many of the protagonists of the Confederation of Iranian Students. So I think this book is not just armchair theorizing. It's not sort of it's somebody who has lived a life which has very much been invested in and deeply involved in and committed to political, like a progressive and sort of political radicalism in many ways. And it's amazing in the day and age where many, for instance, former leftists have now become pro Pahlavi or something, pro the kind of the Assad regime, and we're living in this twilight, this very bizarre world nowadays, where people have kind of gone back and forth, and they kind of he's retained and remained steadfast and completely faithful to these kind of principles. So it's not just like a kind of a sanitized neutral work of scholarship. It's much more than that. And I think I just wanted to emphasize that. I thought that was really just important to kind of contextualize that before we kind of probed any deeper, because I think like people really, listeners and readers, need to kind of really, it's great if you can grasp that. I think it adds an additional layer for how we read the book.
Can I add something, Jason?
Of course.
Yeah, Iskandar's point about Afshin's history is absolutely correct, but I just want to dispense with yet another myth, in the spirit of dispensing with myth, that there were these leftists that now have turned right. They have never been leftists. They have been propagandists of one sort of or another. This mythology that, oh, they were leftists and then suddenly they saw the light and they became monarchists. I mean, Iskandar knows this. Afshin is a solid casebook example of progressive critical thinkers from his childhood, from his youth, from his student years, to this day, and to this the evidence of this book. There is a consistency in Afshin's biography and scholarship and critical thinking that is very typical of his generation.
Well, Afshin, I hope you're enjoying these compliments.
To say to that, both Iskandar and Hamid, whatever is the trajectory of my, political life, intellectual development, Hamid is someone who is just a tad older, so I've been following him as some kind of a master guru, and now you can see that with his beard. So if he has that, none of us can compete with that. And no, I'm serious. And Iskandar, of course, much younger than both of us, but Iskandar has played a major role in past 10, 15 years since I've met him in kind of guiding me as a younger colleague, fellow socialist, and giving me a lot of hope that where we came from, it was not a dead end. And there is a younger generation, people like Iskandar, who are doing this and doing this better than my generation. So we're in good hands.
So again, the show's in good hands. Well, I'm going to throw this question out to everybody, and whoever wants to go can go. I guess, I kind of want to go back to the beginning. And how did Britain and Russia's dominance shape the U.S. role as a non-colonial alternative without actually opposing imperial structures?
Yeah, short of making this kind of a boring, long historical narrative, Russia and Britain as imperial powers were very much involved in Iran throughout the 19th century. Some observers have said Iran was in a semi-colonial status at that time. I don't think the actual words matter as much, but they had tremendous influence. As we get to the 20th century, the British influence becomes even more important because of oil. They have an oil concession in southern Iran, and then the British Navy switches from coal to oil and Iranian oil becomes paramount. Abadan becomes the world's largest refinery in southern Iran, and Iranian oil is major. And in the aftermath of World War I, just to make a fast forward, the U.S. begins to enter this equation, but not really in a major way. I would say it's probing. And one thing I wanted to add to that, the myth of U.S.-Iran relations, is that uh, I distinguish between, uh, in the beginning of the book, I say that when we say U.S.-Iran relations, we have to be clear what we mean by U.S. and what we mean by Iran. And ideally, I would have wanted to write a book of like a people's history, relations, not just focused on states and governments, but on a much wider cultural, political history and bring non-state actors in. Unfortunately, when the states enter, then they dominate and they impose the framework for understanding US-Iran relations. It forced upon us to look at the role of the state. And so the goodwill that existed maybe in early 20th century was because American missionaries in the 19th century had played a role that one could consider at least partly beneficial. They were utterly unsuccessful in terms of converting anyone to their cause, but they provided some education, healthcare, and that had a good impact. The Americans were known as people who are here to help us in some ways, but these were individual Americans acting on their own for whatever motivations they had. They had nothing to do with the US government. And so were the rare individuals like Morgan Schuster, who was a financial advisor. He came to Iran during the Constitutional Revolution. He had a brief stay, but he left behind a good name as a defender of Iranian constitutionalism vis-a-vis Russian and British impositions. Then there was young man Howard Baskerville, who was just caught in a revolutionary warfare, the defense of the city of Tabriz against a monarchist coup against the Iranian constitution, and he died. So these individual Americans created that, and then there were also others who were involved in education, boys and girls education in Iran. There was Samuel Jordan, but none of these people represented the U.S. government. When the U.S. government entered the equation, it was backing, even from the early 1920s, oil concessions. It was probing for economic influence. And then everything changes when the US enters and joins the Anglo-Soviet occupation of Iran in early World War II. And then the involvement becomes massive. 30,000 US military personnel enter Iran. And from then on, then when we talk about US-Iran relations, we're talking about governments.
Did you want to add something, Xander?
No, I'm good. I'm happy just
You're just listening.
No. If I've got something, I won't talk for the
Well,
sense.
maybe
Hamid has something more to add.
Yes, indeed, I do.
There was something. The early 20th century, even some American statesmen who I don't necessarily, approve of very much, they wanted to use the U.S. as a equalizer, as a balancing act between, they're thinking the U.S. is far away, they haven't had colonial kind of interest in Asia, so maybe we could use the U.S. to gain some leverage against the British and the Russians. And so I don't want to entirely dismiss that as these people were, but it was an illusion, and they should have realized soon that that is not the case. I would even include someone like Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister who was overthrown in 1953, as harboring deeply flawed illusions about the possibility of, again, relying on the US to dislodge the British from Iran. And this in the chapter that I discussed the coup, in my second chapter, I think I'm critical of Mossadegh for that. And I know that a lot of my nationalist Iranian friends may not like that, but I think he too harbored that illusion that he thought that maybe the Truman administration might be favoring his attempt of oil nationalization and be an ally and a supporter. I would argue, and here it's not just my argument, I rely on other scholars, primarily Erwan Abrahamian, who has argued that no, the US was steadily interested in Iranian oil and it never really supported Mossadegh. Eisenhower administration was planned and executed the coup, but the Truman administration never really supported Mossadegh either. It was always aligned with the British.
Amit, you wanted to
Yeah,
add something?
I just wanted to go back, corroborating things that Afshin was saying about the moment that the British are in Iran throughout the 19th century, early 20th century, until the US enters the game. In my work, I make a distinction between territorial imperialism and aterritorial imperialism. Territorial imperialism is land conquest. Russian economy was not that productive or advanced to work through aterritorial imperialism. They just wanted land. So throughout late 18th and early 19th century, there are these battles between the Qajar dynasty, the dynasty before the Pahlavis, and the Russians. And the Russians have this territorial acquisition through two successive treaties. So they just want land. And ultimately, they want to have access to the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. That's their objective. Whereas British imperialism, even at the time, is transnational. They have their India. India is the jewel of their crown, and they want to protect India. So all the machinations that they do around India is for the control of India. American imperialism is aterritorial. And the best example I always give is territorial imperialism is like soccer, like European football. You need to conquer land and move forward towards the goal. Territorial imperialism is like American football. You don't need land. All you need is a quarterback, the center of the empire, and you need a wide receiver somewhere, Israel, Saudi Arabia, what have you. So there is this connection. The key chapter in Afshin's book, in my opinion, is chapter 3, Building a Cold War Client State. That is when American imperialism becomes fully developed. And earlier, Afshin talks about individuals, Schuster and Baskerville and so forth, and he's absolutely right. But by the time we get into the Cold War, Iran becomes an epicenter of American military and strategic interest. Throughout his early period, the Shah was providing the US with a military base during the Vietnam War and so forth. This is when Iran becomes integral to the emergence of American territorial imperialism, which to this day we call it empire of the bases. Is not from Israel to Saudi Arabia to Central Asia. The US doesn't need territorial command. Right now, even in the case of Venezuela, Trump says it bluntly. They don't want Venezuela. They just want the oil of Venezuela. And the same thing is with Iran. Currently, the assumption that Donald Trump is interested in democracy in Iran, when we look at the streets of Minnesota and ICE is just acting like a fascist operation, then suddenly, or Netanyahu having slaughtered tens of thousands of Palestinians that many consider a genocide, he's very interested in the case of democracy in Iran, are delusional. So going back to Afshin's book, he, as a critical thinker, he just focuses on realities of the geopolitics of the region, dynamics of Iranian history, dynamics of American involvement, in order for us to dispense with all of these illusions around us. And the timing of this book, I cannot overemphasize. the horror of the social media and the way that nobody reads books anymore. Books have disappeared. And a conversation around a solid, documented, researched, argued book that gives you a long history from the late 19th century all the way to our current time gives us not only a way of thinking about contemporary today. Every day we get up in the morning, we're afraid that US may have started bombing various spots in Iran. But also to have a vision of global history and regional history that is no longer subject to whims of one social media posting or another. There is this erasure of memory. This book generates and sustains systematic, consistent, logical, critical, historical memory for us to have to come back to it. So we need to understand the nature of this book helps us understand the nature of American imperialism, not just specifically about Iran, but about the whole region. So there are regional implications to this book that, to me, is as important as the specific case of Iran.
Since I have all three of you experts on the region in front of me, now I can get some questions that I've had for years. You, in your second chapter, you paint a very interesting picture of Mossadegh because you're talking about the entire moment that he's in, pressures from the British, Russia, and of course the United States. Everything else I've read about this moment or even heard about this moment kind of puts Mossadegh as a very sympathetic figure that is overthrown by U.S. cunning and intelligence. And you paint a slightly different picture that maybe had Mossadegh handled the situation better, it probably wouldn't have happened the way it happened. Can you take us back to that moment before 53 and any of you guys, because I've got the panel of experts right now.
Yeah, no, you pointed to something important. I, of course, am very
We lost
sympathetic to
Afshin's voice.
Is my voice lost?
I can't hear.
We can hear you. I can hear you.
You can hear
I
me?
can't hear Afshin.
Well, should I continue?
You're fine, Afshin. You keep going. You're fine.
All right. Well, this is a complicated and difficult to handle issue, and I might have a bit of Mossadegh revisionism, even though, as I said, I'm highly sympathetic to him. Who couldn't be? Although he's under heavy attack these years by all kinds of revisionists who want to bring down Mossadegh. And there's also a myth of Mossadegh that he is unassailable and you cannot say anything critical of him. There's a view by some of our best scholars, even those on the left, that argue that no matter what Mossadegh had done, the outcome would have been the same and the US and the British would have brought him down. I didn't agree with that because there's also a similar argument in the case of the Islamic Republic, to which I think we get soon. And that is the Iranian side of this equation, US and Iran, also has some agency. Obviously, the US is an enormously more powerful side. And if you want to look at this in terms of who has more responsibility, is the side with more power. That side has more agency. But as you said, I've argued that Mossadegh might have acted differently because when it came to the moment of the coup, Mossadegh had lost the National Front coalition that was backing him, had fallen apart. There are a few small parties that still supported him. They were not even political parties. The only real political party in Iran at that time was the Tudeh Communist Party, Stalinist, staunchly pro-Soviet. And relations between Mossadegh and Tudeh were tense, to put it best. Today was hostile to Mossadegh, but then it came around slightly to be neutral and then kind of semi-supportive. But I think the best outcome would have been somehow for Mossadegh and the Tudeh party to come to some kind of understanding that no, the Tudeh wasn't going to go for a power grab. And this should have also come, I think, through Mossadegh mending fences with Moscow, with the Soviet Union. He didn't need to go as far as, becoming, chummy with them. But he might have improved relations with the Soviets would have served him better than relying so heavily on the Americans, until when he himself realized, no, these guys are undermining me and they're going to overthrow me. And I also think that he might have, given the outcome of what happened, nationalization was in some ways reversed in content, if not in form. If Mossadegh had accepted some kind of a compromise deal, things might have been different. I'm not sure. We can't just prove counterfactual history. I'm not saying things would have been different, but they could have been. And if I may, we may or may not get to this point. I want to project that into the present moment, and maybe make an argument that in the back and forth between the Islamic Republic and the US, there's an argument also that no matter what the Islamic Republic had done, it would have been the same thing from the US, even all the way to the present moment. I think that, no, it's possible that had the Iranian government made different choices, maybe the outcome would be different.
Could I add something to that? Again, it's sticking to Afshin's book, chapter 2, about Mossadegh. The bone of contention between Mossadegh movement and the left is enduring among the Iranian historians and critical thinkers. In fact, one reason that Kermit Roosevelt, who executed the CIA coup in 1953, he calls his book Counter Coup. The assumption is that the Soviets and the Tudeh party were about to stage a coup against Mossadegh because Mossadegh was soft on them. And as a result, they did a counter coup. But there is a more serious theoretical perspective. And one, Mossadegh represents an anti-colonial nationalism. Colonialism is a key issue here. Mossadegh is at the same level as Nehru in India and Nasser in Egypt. I remember when I was in Egypt, in Cairo, I saw a street named after Mossadegh. So the question is whether you look at it as a socialist, leftist thinker, that primacy is the primacy of socialist uprisings, or do you consider colonialism as a critical factor? The two are not mutually exclusive. They are actually complementary. But Mossadegh's failings that Mafshin documents judiciously, he's not gung-ho in that chapter, very judiciously, something that Ervand Abrahamian has also talked about, and other historians, is precisely because of this tension between anti-colonial nationalism. And in the formation of anti-colonial nationalism, Nasser, for example, jailed many Marxist leftists in Cairo, in Egypt. And there were leftist movements in India that Nehru didn't get along with. So the question is, where do you go? Do you go anti-colonial nationalism, and that has its advantages and flaws, or do you go on third world socialism, that it has its advantages and its flaws? And in that second chapter, Afshin has a very balanced and judicious perspective, not because of the symbolic and iconic significance of Mossadegh in contemporary Iranian history, but simply because of these two dimensions of anti-colonial nationalism and third world socialism.
What do we get wrong when we don't try to analyze these left movements in places like Iran in this moment in time? What do we miss?
Maybe Iskandar can say something to that.
Thanks for putting me in it. No, can I actually go back? Because I actually did have a few points I was going to raise, if that's all right.
Yeah.
No, just because I just thought it was, I mean, obviously Hamid touched on lots of really important points and did a fantastic job, as did Afshin. But no, I just wanted to emphasize exactly that Mossadegh is seen very much as a sort of a figure who foreshadows, the Bandung kind of moment. But the thing that I wanted to actually highlight was that this is a moment when, sovereign rights were very much not at all self-evident to imperial powers. And this is actually very relevant today, insofar as if we recall sort of what Trump was saying about Venezuela. He was sort of saying, they stole our oil. So it's actually, I mean, I think when we sort of go back to the period in which Mossadegh was, when he was sort of emerging as a politician and a figure, these things were by no means self-evident. It was, the Anglo-Persian oil companies. So, okay, we found this oil. It's our concession. We developed it. We built the refinery. This is ours, basically. There was no sort of sense that the Iranians have some entitlement to this because it is on their soil. So we take it for granted. Well, we can take it less for granted today, but at least until fairly recently, this was something that was established. This sort of notion of sovereign rights, right? This is something that was very much established and was a win, was an achievement of these anti-colonial movements. And obviously we see like Mossadegh was a very significant figure. And then this was then further consolidated, obviously, in successive waves of decolonization, which was, untold amounts of blood was spilt for. And, many people's lost their greatest and, most brilliant lights. So I think that was important. I mean, the other thing I would say just regarding Mossadegh, which I think is important to note, is that, I mean, I know from speaking to friends and who are maybe less familiar with Iran, sometimes there's this impression that he was some sort of socialist figure. I mean, we have to kind of situate him in his context, that he was very much a patrician. He was an aristocrat. He was a scion of the Qajar dynasty, right? But he was someone of principle who kind of very vehemently saw the detrimental impact of British colonialism and Russian colonialism in Iran, and he was adamantly sort of opposed to that. But yes, he wasn't a leftist. He wasn't a card-carrying socialist. He was a patrician who obviously had then gone and studied in Switzerland and had studied law and was, at heart, I guess, a constitutionalist, but he also had this sort of populist dimension and exactly this kind of anti-colonial dimension, which, because he lived sort of through the time where Iran was so dominated by these rival powers, and he was a man of sort of principle. So, I mean, I think actually Afshin's critique is very, as we should. I mean, there are no sacred cows. There is nobody beyond criticism, right? And perhaps you could say it's misplaced to kind of expect Mossadegh to have fulfilled this role of some sort of, I mean, in a sense, successive generations would then take Mossadegh's legacy. So I think this is also important to note that, so Mossadegh himself was a patrician, he was a constitutionalist, he was anti-colonial, but actually, in a sense, Mossadegh sort of, I don't say disciples, but for the generation that saw 1953 as this watershed, as this sort of, this chasm in Iranian history, basically developed this anti-colonial dimension and radicalized the logic of it, you could argue, and also many of them became socialists as well, and also radicalized this as well. So I think this is actually obviously very important to note, and maybe Afshin wants to say more about that. And just one other thing that I think might be interesting to note is that there is kind of there was also like a denialism around the coup for very many decades, basically, right? And while huge swaths of Iranians knew very well that a coup had taken place, I mean, they knew they had very little doubt that there was a coup that had taken place that had ousted Mossadegh's government. The official line of the Pahlavis was that this was actually a people's uprising. This was like an organic uprising, which obviously got rid of Mossadegh and so on and so forth. Which, So that's one thing that I think is also kind of worth noting, that like people after the coup did see this themselves, like revolutionary militants, activists, they basically very much understood what had happened. They understood that the United States had played an absolutely decisive role in many ways of changing the course and trajectory of Iranian history. And of course, I think Afshin raises like a very important point, that we can now obviously look at this legacy of Mossadegh more soberly and say like, okay, like what could have this gone a different way potentially? And I think obviously it's very important that he's kind of opening that kind of conversation.
Is that a uncomfortable conversation to have in Iranian studies?
Yes, that's one of the uncomfortable conversations. But I want to add something else to that I think I tried to do in the book, is that oil nationalization and that moment of confrontation between Iran and the power of the British Empire had another major component that the narratives of that period almost always leave out. And that's the role of the Iranian working class in that anti-imperialist movement. There are major strikes at the Abadan refinery and oil industry in the 1920s, one of the largest of its kind in the world. And then there were major kind of similar major strike just before and around the time that Mossadegh became prime minister. And these were so massive that the British were going to bring in gunships and defend their control of the refinery. Tens of thousands of workers were involved. But in the usual narratives of nationalization, there's scant attention to the role of the working class. It's kind of, you want to look at history from below, you have to take that into consideration. Both workers who were involved in this in their own initiative, and those who were organized by the Communist Tudeh Party. And in fact, the demand for oil nationalization, there's an assumption that somehow it began in the 1950s. But the Abadan oil strike, workers' strike of the 1920s, already had put forward that demand of oil nationalization.
And after 53, the U.S. is helping build the Shah's security state, correct?
Yes, if we want to push this narrative forward, we can begin with the moment of significant, massive U.S. kind of barging onto the Iranian political scene, and that's during early Second World War, when the Nazi army is advancing into Soviet territory. And it seems like the fate of the war is hanging in the balance. The Soviets and the British are kind of unlikely, but out of necessity, allies. And Iran then becomes the so-called bridge of victory, because the US comes in and they send massive amounts of war material through Iran to the Soviets. And this has a lot to do with Soviet resistance. I don't want to take the credit or whatever one wants to call it from the Red Army in turning the tide of the war. But the role of Iran in this kind of titanic struggle, whatever you want to call it, is also very important. But I want to emphasize, and I do emphasize in the book, that from that moment, what becomes key in US policy towards Iran is building links to the Iranian military. Sometimes in the narratives of 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, the linkage of the US to the Shah, to the person of the Shah, and to the institution of the monarchy is emphasized, which is true. But I think US conscious and deliberate linkaging to the armed forces is more important. And we see this even when ultimately, when the Shah falls, Carter makes a decision that, okay, maybe we can let this guy go, but can we salvage our deep linkages to the Iranian armed forces? So whoever replaces the Shah is going to have an army that is linked to the US. That doesn't work out because the Iranian army collapses. But I think the US has two pillars of linkage to Iran, US government, US imperialism, if you want. Deep linkage to the Iranian armed forces and a very strong stake in Iranian oil, which the US companies get. When Mossadegh is overthrown, the monopoly of the British over Iranian oil is broken. And in the new arrangement, then US oil companies have an equal share in Iranian oil, equal to the British. So oil and armed forces are the two main defining pillars of this imperial linkage.
Hamid?
I just want to add an element that is not oil, that is not military, and it's American and is extremely important. And that is when the US GI, American GIs during World War II, when they were in Iran, these GIs were carrying pocketbooks with them. Mark Twain, you know, Faulkner, etc. They were reading them. When they left Iran, they left those books behind. And those books became the foundation of my generation's interest in American literature. We grew up with two bodies of non-Persian literature, Russian, because it was so close to us, and also because many of the translators were born to mixed families. Their mother or father was Russian and so forth. So we grew up with Russian literature, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, etc., but also with American literature. To this day, I mean, I've studied aspects of European literature, British, French, etc., but it is not home to me. I'm home with American and Russian. Part of this fascination with American culture and history has to do with that literary aspect, which we mistranslated into political idealism. Langston Hughes, for example, appears in a poem of Ahmad Shamlu when he's talking about, and he was one of the most revolutionary poets of our generation. How did he learn about Langston Hughes? How did he know about Langston Hughes? Etc., etc. So Afshin begins with, rightly, with persons. He says these are individuals, these are not state-related, and he's absolutely correct. But in the aftermath of World War II, we also have a literary admiration and fixation and enamored with American literature that to this day is irreconcilable with American imperialism. So there is a way for us to remain, sometimes I put it bitterly, the worst thing about the United States is there is always hope for it. Because Afshin and I both have lived in this country for most of our adult lives. And you cannot but be admiring of those who have a different vision of the United States. That was rooted in my generation. I was born in 1951, that we became familiar with American literature, and that is how that remains. So he actually opens a bifurcation between individual aspects and state aspects. I don't think we should lose sight of that binary as we move on through the history of our encounter with American presence in Iran.
Eskander, did you want to add something?
I not too much. I didn't want to because obviously I guess we need to kind of plod along, and but there were a few things just to emphasize slightly. So you were referencing the chapter where it's talking about the indispensable role of the United States in building up, a client state and like a security apparatus. So obviously, the United States and then subsequently the Israelis were really important in building up the Savak, so the kind of infamous sort of intelligence security apparatus in Iran. And this was obviously in the context of the Cold War, and obviously the foremost enemy that had to be, in a sense, deracinated, extirpated across Iran was the left, communists, and so on. Obviously, not only them, but they were often seen as the foremost kind of problem to be dealt with. And we have actually lots of footage of like following the coup of communists who were basically being interrogated and almost like, and in a sense, I mean, people don't often know this. They often think about the Islamic Republic, they set up the, sort of the show trials and this very televised, spectacular way of sort of exhibiting penitence on the part of its political enemies. But actually the Pahlavi, you find there's lots of evidence that this actually started under the Pahlavis, actually, which people don't really want to talk about, which I think is an interesting thing to reflect on. And I mean, also we just have to kind of look at the shifting role of the Pahlavi regime in the context of the imperial system. So we move from a period where the Shah was far more dependent on the United States, to one where we have by the 70s, early to mid 70s, we obviously have this massive oil windfalls and boom. And at the same time, the United States, is sort of coming out of this protracted imperial intervention in Vietnam. And it's in this period, actually, that we see the emergence of what, the twin pillars doctrines under the Nixon administration, where, increasingly the Shah is seen as what was referred to the gendarme of the Persian Gulf, right? So in a sense, as a sub-imperial power to which, basically carrying out these broader counter-revolutionary aims, which American empire had for the region, the Shah is kind of expected to do his duty and to curtail the role of communists and radical movements and counter Arab nationalism and so on and so forth. And I mean, probably one of the best cases of this is the role of the Iranian military in the Dhofar Revolution, repressing the Dhofar Revolution, which with very much working hand in glove with the sort of the twilight of the British Empire, which in 1970 had staged a coup in Oman, had installed Sultan Qaboos, had ousted his father, and in a sense helped reboot and build up this absolutist state in Oman. And the Shah, as a kind of a sub-imperial power here, was absolutely crucial. And the other thing that I just would want to add, the last thing I would like to add, I think it's something which I've been interested in and concerned about, and I'm sure that both Hamid and Afshin, certainly in this book, is also pushing against this, is this kind of recent revisionist historiography regarding the Pahlavi era, and particularly regarding Mohammad Reza Shah, that sort of seeks to present him as sort of this sort of great independent third worldist leader who was not in any way, dependent on or had this relationship with American imperialism. And actually he was, and obviously this is very much often aligns with a more crude monarchist kind of conspiracy theory, where they actually believe that there was no revolution. Basically, Mohammad Reza Shah was ousted because he was getting too big for his boots, kind of thing. So, and obviously this is obviously ridiculous, right? But there is a kind of a scholarly kind of correlate or equivalent, which has sort of been trying to kind of, rebrand the Pahlavi era and sort of rewrite the historical record here. And I think it's really important that Afshin is obviously pushing back against that as well, which I think is very kind of significant.
This Iskandar and Afshin know this body of literature better than I do, but to the best of my knowledge, what Afshin was saying in terms of Iskandar was saying in terms of revisionist historiography, that Shah was a thing, is really an internet rumor. There is no scholarship in that. There's not a single serious scholar worth the name. Any major university press, any major trade press would come out and make that ridiculous argument. I also wanted to mention something by way of saying that Afshin has not been in touch with me, and that is Vincent Sheehan. You see, Vincent Sheehan was an American journalist and a novelist, and in 1920, this is the original copy, 1926, he went to Iran, and Reza Shah had just come to power, and he wrote this The New Persia, a magnificent book that is, the perspective is different from those like Baskerville and Schuster and Millspaw about whom Afshin talks, because out of the blue, he was traveling all over the place, and this is really a travelogue. But at the same time, the dating of it is early Pahlavi period, and would have added to Afshin's ammunition as he makes his argument. I mean, this is a rare book. For a weird reason, I have it. One of my close friends was a fan of Vincent Sheehan. That serves you right, Afshin, that you should not touch base with me, disappear into thin air until you're, you know.
You always got to
So,
hit up the homies, Afshin. You can't just.
well, let me just say quickly something. I know we may want to move to beyond the Pahlavi period, but what Hamid said about the cultural impact of the US and the authors you mentioned, I think that's very important. I get to that to some extent in my chapter 3, and that is the development of a Cold War culture in Iran. And yeah, I acknowledge that. I begin the book with a quote from Mark Twain, the anti-imperialist. And I have to say that the first real book I read in first grade was a Persian translation of Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. And so that kind of, whatever you want to call it, progressive, open to the world, cosmopolitan part of American culture had reached Iran, along with everything else. And it's complicated how that interaction worked, because, and I don't want to take our time too much on that, but I think there was a moment between when the U.S. entered the war and the end of the war, the moment of the Popular Front, when the Americans and the British and the Soviets were on the same side. And it seemed like they're on the same side of history, some kind of, if not coexistence, but actually close collaboration between them could be possible. You see a reflection of that in some kind of cultural consensus that maybe even the communists are on the same side as the Americans and the British. And there was something to that, but it changes when the Cold War begins, and Iran is one of the first places where this happens. The alliance breaks up. Things change, but then throughout the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, as a left-leaning high school students, I think these are the things Hamid was alluding to. I was growing up, and I found a very appealing side to the American culture, but it was this anti-imperialist progressive side. The writers who are not necessarily politically on the left, but they kind of lean towards a cosmopolitan worldview that was progressive. They made a huge impact in Iran. So that's another correction you made, and yeah, that's justified. It's a complicated issue to handle. Because of the many books you've written on this, you handle culture, you handle literature, you handle cinema, so you're the person to make that corrective, and you're right. To some extent, the book addresses that.
Well, I do want to move on kind of in the moment right before the revolution. In the book, you talk about the 60s and 70s as kind of a high point in U.S.-Iranian relations on the road to revolution. How do arms sales, oil revenue, and the U.S. cultural influence, what we're talking about now, deepen social contradictions inside Iran?
Yeah, very complicated. I don't remember well that part of the book, so maybe Ascan.
Well, I mean, I also want to ask because you were there. So I kind of want to get a feeling of what it was like to be there at that time. You know, you call it a high point in Iran.
Yeah, I can tell you one story. Kind of just here, I follow Hamid's style. That I was in eighth grade, early high school in Iran, and it was maybe 1968, 1969, and we had an American visitor, and people were debating the Vietnam War, and I just made I wasn't that fluent in English, but I made a sentence and delivered it to this guest, and it was something like, America has no place in Vietnam. And this guest, who was a woman, looked at me and said, "You're a communist, aren't you?" Just by that sentence. And I said, wow, she's so perceptive. How did she know? But I mean, that's where my sympathies were as a like 13, 14-year old. And I know I wasn't alone. That sympathy was all over the world. And it didn't necessarily make you a communist, but to her, because I was on the Vietnamese side, I must have been a communist. And even to me, I thought, well, maybe I am, because, who's the enemy and who is the side that we're defending.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I grew up in that milieu. I came to the US in 1974, right at the moment when the Vietnam War had ended. The Vietnamese were victorious. Nixon was crying and resigning in shame. And I just jumped into this new left student movement milieu of activism. I was not a activist in the sense of just constantly being in protest, which are fine, but I kind of gravitated more to the intellectual side, reading a lot, kind of debating, being not kind of just going for this idea that if you're on the left, you have to follow the line of a political organization. I thought you should read, you should analyze, you should criticize the left. If there was anything in my background, the credit that Iskandar so graciously gave me is that I thought if you're on the left, you should think, you should be critical, and you should also be critical of the left. You should learn and you should grow. And that's why when I went back to Iran in December 1978, I could see that, yes, this is a mass popular revolution, but I was also worried and concerned for the direction it was taking. Yes, everyone was for the fall of the Shah. But what would replacing it was a big puzzle. I mean, it was like, okay, Khomeini is the leader, without dispute, millions are for him, but what is going to replace this? And early on, like the first month of the Islamic Republic, before it was actually formed, yes, there was a referendum and it was declared that Iran is going to have an Islamic Republic. But I worked for a leftist newspaper, and I gravitated towards a view that was the new state formation. We have to beware because it's showing, we can debate this, but there was a view that the new state is showing fascist tendencies. It's enormously popular. It's right wing. Its enemy is identified on the left. And it may be anti-imperialist, but what kind of anti-imperialism is this? That's a difficult question. Is anti-imperialism by definition progressive, or are there kinds of anti-imperialism that are genuine, but they may not be progressive? They could even be reactionary.
Is that what the feeling was in the air?
No, that was the feeling of a very small minority. Okay. Even in the left, the Iranian left split over that question, and I would say the part that I belong to, I came to this early on, even before the Shah was overthrown. But the left was extremely divided, bitterly divided. The Tudeh party, the Communist Party that came back from exile and rebuilt itself very quickly, was leading a line that you have to support the Islamic Republic because it's anti-imperialist. And this argument became much more powerful with the hostage crisis, with the taking of the US embassy, which Khomeini himself declared as the second revolution. And at that point, yes, the Islamic Republic was in a direct confrontation with the US, effectively at war. The sanctions that are continuing to the present were slapped on right at that moment. There was also talk of, with Carter militarily intervened. There was a botched rescue attempt to go into Tehran and snap up all these hostages. And the plan was you just scorch the ground and you kill anyone and everything on your way. That was part of the plan. But, and yes, half of the hostages might die, but we get the rest of them out. Luckily, perhaps it was divine intervention. The planes and the helicopters crashed into each other and they had to return. But US and Iran have been effectively at war. So if we want to kind of move forward to this part of narrative, yes.
Yeah, I think the hostage crisis and Carter to Reagan, play a big role here. What do you guys see as the big differences geopolitically with the Carter regime and then Reagan following soon after, and the hostage crisis?
I wonder if I could go back to 60s.
Sure.
Before we get to there. I remember when Americans landed on Moon, 1969. I was in high school, and I've written about this in my childhood memoir, and I had created a bookshelf for myself in our home, and so I had a bookshelf and books. So I needed some sort of a political statement. So I remember there was a cover of a magazine in Iran with a white hand and a black hand shaking, and under it had written in Persian, "Mushkiltar az taskhir faza," more difficult than conquering the space. That in 1969 meant we were aware of the civil rights movement in the United States. We were aware of MLK assassination. We were aware of Malcolm X assassination. I remember vividly, we would wake up wee hours in the morning in order to watch Ali play in his boxing game. So our fascination with progressive aspects of American history, the civil rights movement in particular, and with Malcolm X, did not stop in the aftermath of coup 1953. The coup of 1953, as everybody knows, had a deep traumatic impact on the collective Iranian psyche. But that also became a turning point, identification with the civil rights movement, with the anti-war movement, with MLK, with Malcolm X, with particularly with Ali, meant that this bifurcation continued in the 1960s until we get into 1970s and the revolution. Yeah, I just wanted to add this dimension of the 1960s. Yeah.
Ex-Kander, did you want to add something?
No, I mean, I don't have anything to add really. It's just obviously I thought like Afshin laid out sort of his own kind of experience and how in some sense he was kind of a canary in the coal mine. And I think part of there was a significant current of leftist opinion which did reach this conclusion, but there was a very also, considerable one which believed that anti-imperialism sort of trumped all other considerations, as basically people's civil rights and human rights increasingly were crushed. So I think and this is obviously still a kind of debate which just continues interminably, and it's almost like we're Sisyphus pushing this rock up the hill, and it's just it's again and again and again, and it seems like we're often replaying, and so there's endless repetition of these debates, and they're ones which very much are still with us today. And unfortunately, there are those who still kind of hold this position, and so no, I think we probably should move on. So we're actually speaking more directly, maybe about the fallout of the hostage crisis, the consolidation of the Islamic Republic, then obviously the 8-year war with Iraq and its implications, and then following on from that. So I don't know if you want to take it there, Jason.
Oh yeah. I do want to know a little bit about the hostage crisis and how that allowed the Islamic Republic to consolidate internal power. And in what ways did I'll add this on there, in what ways did the U.S. hostility strengthen clerical authoritarianism rather than weaken it?
The hostage crisis, from the perspective of the U.S. government from Carter onwards to the present, is like the original sin of the Islamic Republic that is very difficult to erase or to be forgotten. And I'm not sure to what extent Hamid or Iskandar agree with me on this, but I see it as, and in the book I argue that this contention or confrontation with the US has been foundational to defining the character of the Islamic Republic. In my analysis, I'm not claiming any kind of foresight for myself, but I was back in the US from Iran when it happened. But even then, my take was this is the primary objective is regime consolidation. The Islamic Republic was not fully formed yet. There was a war in Kurdistan between insurgents and the central government that was trying to form itself. The Pasdaran, the Revolutionary Guards, were formed in that crucible. And things were not going well for the project of an Islamic Republic. The hostage crisis changed everything because dissent became impossible. Once a revolution hits itself against a foreign enemy, and it's not just Iran, you see this pattern. How did the Bolsheviks consolidate? The civil war and fighting against counter-revolutionaries and their foreign allies. How did the Jacobins consolidate the French Revolution? You need a foreign nemesis. And I think in some ways, the Islamic Republic fabricated that nemesis. I don't think they really were concerned about the Shah being restored. He was dying, and everybody knew that. And the US, even when the documents of the embassy were revealed, they did not reveal a coup plan to restore the monarchy in Iran. So in my reading, the hostage crisis was enormously important. And no matter what consequences, it helped consolidate the Islamic Republic. I think it had enormously negative consequences. Iran were isolated. Practically every country and power in the world condemned it. The Soviets did. And then Iraq invaded Iran, and isolated Iran was attacked by Iraq, which that could have overthrown the regime also. It didn't. So the war in the long run also in some ways helped regime consolidation, but the price of it was enormous. And I'm not saying that that moment defined everything, but the formation of an Islamic Republic as a state where security, intelligence, standing to a foreign threat is the pivot of almost everything. That continues to the present. The role of, military and paramilitary organizations, the role of the Pasdaran, these things all go back to that decision in the ensuing decades. We can debate this. I think the onus of responsibility is mostly on the U.S., but I can't say that the Islamic Republic was just like a victim of sheer imperialist aggression, and therefore the role of progressive is to support it no matter what. I think they had a role to play. We can discuss this. Did the regime's nuclear program had a kind of contribute to this? Did its regional allies, the so-called axis of resistance, what choice and options were this? And so what is the responsibility of the Islamic Republic in bringing us to this fateful moment we're facing right now?
Actually, could I come in on this? I think it obviously raises a lot of issues. So, I mean, as Afshin and Habib know really well, I mean, at the time, Fred Halliday, sort of a leftist scholar of the region and international relations, I mean, he famously called it kind of the imperialism of fools. And this is because he thought ultimately this isn't a blow to the imperialist system in any kind of meaningful kind of sense, which I think is true ultimately in the final analysis. Of course, that is the case. The one thing I would kind of say, though, is that the shadow of 1953 was, I mean, I think we can hold two things on our head. So on the one hand, I do think the shadow of 53 was very real, and there was this genuine fear and perception that the Americans somehow, whether, you know, through the Iranian military, as we were talking about, given those extensive links, or some other way, would try to obviously nip the revolution, you know, basically snuff, you know, sort of smother it in the cradle, as it were. So I do think that was real, and I do think that motivated the revolutionary actors. But exactly as sort of Afshin said, I mean, what's actually interesting to see is that once basically the revolutionary students of the Imam's line, as they were called, basically took the US embassy, and they got their hands on this like treasure trove of American CIA and intelligence documents. They then used these documents very systematically and often quite cynically to basically neutralize, let's just say, the more moderate elements within the revolutionary coalition and the provisional revolutionary government. So they went after the Bazargan government, they went after Amir Entezam, they went after all of these various figures, but then ultimately some of them paid a very, very heavy price, actually, because the historical record obviously shows that the Americans were actually in touch with kind of the moderate elements of the Bazargan, of the kind of the provisional revolutionary government, and were trying to kind of maintain some relationship with them. And this was very much in the context of the Cold War, right? So if we recall, we have to recall that the Soviet Union has invaded Afghanistan at this point. And exactly as Afshin was saying, the US wasn't trying to destabilize Iran. Actually, they were very concerned at this point, because of the Cold War, about stability in Iran, because they were very worried about the danger of like communist sort of penetration in the Islamic Republic. This is why they were sort of, in some instances, quite agnostic about the Islamists. They're sort of, okay, they're clearly not friendly to us, but they're better than the communists, basically. Having power. So, you know, so just to sum up, I mean, I think like on the one hand, there is this genuine legacy of 53, but there is also this dimension that Afshin sort of says of like trying to obviously consolidate to basically gradually this logic of elimination of and sort of exclusion of around the revolutionary coalition and pushing people out, which is a dynamic which you find in all revolutions, I think. And I think one scholar who's also instructive on this, whose work Afshin cites and knows well, Mark Gasiorowski, who also wrote a lot on the coup, he kind of documents that many opposition groups to the nascent Islamic Republic reached out to the CIA and were in touch with the CIA, actually. But the CIA like actually rebuffed them on many times because they were trying to actually enlist the CIA to try and overthrow the fledgling Islamic Republic. And they didn't want to do this exactly because they were worried about the question of communism. And I think this is obviously very different from the context we are today, where actually the interest, because there is, is far more about destabilization and really kind of wreaking havoc. So I think there's a very different dynamic kind of at work as opposed to kind of 79, 80. But that's just, I just wanted to kind of add like an addendum, like a footnote to obviously what Afshin and sort of Hamid have been saying.
If I could add, first of all, Jason, I hope your program kind of goes online and people
are watching right now.
Watch it and listen to it, and becomes a model of nuanced arguments, multiple clauses in one sentence. Before I forget, Iskandar just republished an absolutely iconic book by Fred Holliday, Iran, Dictatorship and Development, that he re-edited and wrote a huge introduction to it. The book was prophetic in its timing and its analysis by the distinguished Irish, right? Iskandar, Irish historian Fred Holliday. The other thing I wanted to add is, of course, Afshin is absolutely correct that Islamic Republic used the occasion of the hostage crisis to consolidate its power in very specific terms. But we should not underestimate, as Iskandar said, the prospect of fear of a repetition of the coup of 1953. We know it from Ambassador Sullivan's memoir that General Heuser was visiting in Iran and was contemplating a military coup. This is a matter of record that is documented in the U.S. ambassador to Iran. But when it happened, which was surprise, Khomeini was not aware of it. Khomeini took advantage of it. It happened by a group of militant students. When it did happen in November 1979, I was in Iran until about 3-4 months before it. Khomeini used it as an occasion of brutally eliminating all the other alternative voices that existed. Those 444 days, as the world attention was distracted to the fate of 52 American hostages, Khomeini was brutally at work eliminating particularly the left that was very active. When the revolution happened, it had three components. Yes, militant Islamism was there, but so was third world socialism, both in the form of the Tudeh party and in the form of Cherikhay Fadayi Khalq, and also the legacy of Mossadegh in figures like Sanjabi and Bazargan, etc. He just eliminated them. This took from November 1979 until January 1981, when the hostages had done their purposes and the constitution of the Islamic Republic was consolidated, the referendum was consolidated, and it became a fait accompli. Before the hostages was released in January 1981, as President Reagan was being inaugurated, I was a graduate student at Penn. We were listening to radio as the hostages were being released. Iran had already started the war with Iraq, which went from 1980 to 1988. And that war was not started by Iran, was started by Iraq, instigated by United States, because you must remember, as Afshin does, as Iskandar does, as all Iranian scholars do, when the Iranian Revolution actually happened, its multidimensionality, it was not an Islamic revolution. It was a revolution that had Islamist component, but was not entirely Islam. It had a vast regional appeal in the Arab world and beyond. Arming of Saddam Hussein and encouraging him to invade Iran was to create a bumper zone between the appeal of Iranian revolution and the larger Arab world. That attack by an Arab Sunni state against Iranian Shia suddenly turned Iranian revolution to what it was not namely a Persian Shia revolution. It was not a Persian Shia revolution, it was a cosmopolitan revolution. They created a similar situation on the eastern frontier with arming the Taliban. Now, the arming of the Taliban had two functions: fighting the Soviets that had invaded Afghanistan, and also creating another bumper zone against Sunni Taliban against the Shia. Now, Khomeini welcomed both of this for 8 years because suddenly a revolution that was multifaceted and had different kinds of aspects to that. The first demonstration against the Islamic Republic on March 8, 1979, few months after Khomeini had landed, was by women against mandatory veiling. This and pictures of it, evidence of it, documentaries of it are all over the place. That 8-year war too was used for mass execution inside prisons, university purges. Anytime I see this character, Mohammad Marandi, coming to television and defending and appearing, plagiarizing people's arguments, he is sitting in a place that has a history of university purges for more than a decade. This is when Islamic Republic became an Islamic Republic. This is the reason that this ruling regime has no popular basis, because the basis of Iranian cosmopolitan context is the base from which an argument and a book like Afshin's emerges. Unless and until we come to terms with a specific period of the early months and years of the revolution, what happened, who did what, we will never have a correct and accurate understanding of the Iranian Revolution. Everybody calls it an Islamic Revolution, whereas it was not an Islamic Revolution. If you begin, there are 3 dates that one can choose as to how and when this revolutionary momentum began. One is the coup of 1953 that gives the revolution its anti-colonial nationalist disposition. One is the June 1963, when Khomeini initially began his uprising against Shah, which gives it his militant Islamist disposition. One is January 1971, what we call in our scholarship Siyah-Kal uprising, which was by a group of militant revolutionary Marxists in northern Iran. They were trying to emulate the Cuban Revolution. These 3 components were integral, and to this day are integral to Iranian political culture. Unless you come to terms with it, you never understand what happened, and you're at the mercy of these monarchists right now and the television that they have created, trying to revise history, in my opinion, entirely useless, because solid, documented scholarship of the sort that Afshin's is now the most recent and excellent example refutes all of that. And I very much hope, by the way, that a paperback edition of this will come and made available, hey, verso, hint, hint, to make it easily available to students.
Again, wherever you guys are watching or listening to the show, there's a link in the description to get Afshin's book, Axis of Empire.
Hardcover is reasonable too, so get it.
Afshin, I only charge 10%, bro, of your royalty. It's a very reasonable. I've been plugging your book. I don't know.
I have a copy myself. They promise I don't have a copy.
Now, I do want to thank you guys again for taking the time to have this conversation with me. I know it's hard to try to parse the history of an entire nation in an hour and some change, but I think we're doing a pretty decent job, and a reason for you guys to get the book. The nuclear deal. How do sanctions become a long-term tool of collective punishment rather than leverage for reform? Afshin, you argued that decades of sanctions failed on their own terms. How do U.S. and Israeli escalation and permanent threat narratives mirror earlier imperial struggles in the region?
Yeah, and here's Hamid and Iskandar both can help me out here. But I think my basic narrative, which is not just my own, I think people who have studied this more or less agree that these sanctions were comprehensive and enormous, and at some point Israel is, of course, the main instigator, focusing on Iran's nuclear program. This is in the early 21st century, a moment where uh, I look at the 1990s as a period of relative détente between the Islamic Republic and the US. Clinton softened the rhetoric. There was reaching out from the Iranian side to improve relations with the US and maybe normalize them. And this reached its peak during the Khatami era, which was the most kind of open and reformist period of the Islamic Republic ever. An experiment that was really destroyed from inside by the hardliners of the regime. But even in the aftermath of Khatami, even in the aftermath of September 11, things between Iran and the US were not at their worst. The sanctions were more or less in effect, but at that crucial point, Israel becomes a major player, seizes on Iran's nuclear energy production program, and warns that this is a project of bomb building. And Iran is a sponsor of international terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
And the Israel lobby is powerful enough to make this official US policy. I'm not saying I don't want to put all of this on Israel. You have to look at the domestic kind of dynamics of how US policy towards Iran is shaped. But the main driver of this is Israel, for whatever reason. And then sanctions become a tool of regime change. This is complicated, and people have argued, did the US and Israel want exactly the same thing? Did both of them wanted to change the regime, or at least the US maybe wanted to change the regime's behavior and make it buckle and accept the terms that the US was dictating? There was a perception that no matter what the Iranian side does, the outcome would be the same. But under Obama, we saw that what the US side did changed the equation. Some kind of a deal was possible. And it worked until Trump came and kicked that deal out and destroyed it. Iran, the Islamic Republic, was abiding by its terms. And from that moment on, then things escalated. We got to the point where we are today. Of course, the Israeli genocide and the events of the past 2-3 years made things much worse. Israel was on an offensive. It destroyed the axis of resistance. This I'm doing a very telegraphic, synopsis of everything. Iskandar has written on this extensively. He has the best account of it. You can call them allies. It's wrong to call them proxies for Iran. Hezbollah has an agenda of its own. Hamas has an agenda of its own. The Syrians had an agenda of its own. Iran's allies in Iraq had their own agenda. But the Islamic Republic developed a military presence outside its borders. And to Israel, this was like the ultimate, totally unacceptable. And whether we like it or not, the Israelis managed to smash it. And Iran became much more vulnerable. Then there was the direct war between the Islamic Republic and Israel. The Islamic Republic, and again, here I'm not like blaming or taking sides. I think it's just you look at the evidence. Israel was assassinating Iranian nuclear scientists. Trump killed Soleimani, this general who was pivotal in Revolutionary Guards operations, and in fact, sometimes had cooperated with the US. So the pressure was coming from especially the Israeli side to raise the level of belligerence. And at some point, the Islamic Republic decided to respond. And then Iran and Israel were an all-out war. Could the Islamic Republic have acted differently, or no matter what it did, we would have had the same outcome? I don't know. But that also relates to this moment that, okay, here we are. Iran and the US have gone in. Trump bombed the hell out of Iran's nuclear facilities. It's an act of war. And Trump is now threatening direct military strike or an all-out war. What options does an Islamic Republic even have? I'm trying to fast forward to the present moment. I don't know. I'm really worried about this. I think the consensus of, I would call it informed opinion, not just politically taking sides. I talk to my colleagues who are not just like on the left, and I think nobody who's sane thinks that foreign intervention is going to do any good. Nor does anybody take the monarchist option seriously. But the difficult question is, the Islamic Republic has one more time contained domestic protests with massive and unprecedented bloodletting. But where is it going to go now? And the US is standing at the gates with the big gun. They put the gun to the regime's head and say, negotiate. What kind of result is possible there? So because it's so easy to answer, I turn it to Iskandar and Hamid.
You recently wrote about this.
That's very depressing. I'm like, all of us are extremely stressed and depressed. Yeah. It's just out of being anxious.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'll just quickly, and then obviously I'd love to hear what Hamid thinks. But I mean, I think one thing that comes through, I mean, I think there's two tracks. So on the one hand, the Islamic Republic is a genuine kind of exponent of a kind of anti-imperialism, which is not one with which we identify. But I think there is a genuine, antagonism there. And that's real. And the Islamic Republic is paranoid, and that paranoia in some sense has sustained it and has allowed it to basically, obviously, eliminate and marginalize all other contenders for power. So, there is this paranoia, but that doesn't mean that somebody's not out there to kind of get you. So I think that is one aspect. But there is, I think, another kind of train of thought that comes out in Afshin's book as well, is that there is this kind of devil's bargain or devilish bargain between the Islamic Republic and US imperialism, insofar as sort of, the sort of unrelenting US imperialism. And just to give you like an example, so, very recently at Davos, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, came out and said very plainly that the whole point of US sanctions is basically to wreck the Iranian economy, to impoverish people so that they will rise up against the regime, right? And that's what we have seen really periodically since 2012, ongoing. And of course, people's demands in Iran aren't purely economic; they are political, they are social, they are diverse and varied. And I think both Afshin and Hamid, they're really incredible kind of sort of scholars who have kind of catalogued this kind of cosmopolitan, highly variegated kind of political culture, which defines Iran, has defined Iran since the late 19th century. But just to get back to this point about this sort of devil's bargain. So on the one hand, you have these unrelenting sanctions, which, they are designed to impoverish millions of people so that they all, they rise up against the regime with which they are very rightfully unhappy about and repudiate, in a very kind of anti-systemic kind of way. And the Islamic Republic, I mean, especially we've been sort of talking, schematically about its history. It has this history of using organized mass violence against ethnic minorities, religious minorities, dissidents, but political activists who obviously take issue with the way it governs the country. And what we've seen recently, on the one hand, the people are impoverished and brutalized by the sanctions, and at the same time, they are brutalized and repressed by the Islamic Republic. And what we've seen, is a massacre. I mean, it's really of unprecedented scale in many ways. and it really marks a really new dark chapter. I mean, the problem, as I see it, for a lot of discourse is that they try to kind of exculpate one or the other. So one says, oh, it's all basically American aggression, American imperialism, American sanctions, which obviously then exculpates the Islamic Republic, which obviously has a track record of like systematic violence and like eliminating any kind of political contenders. On the one hand, right? And on the other hand, there's those who sort of try to exculpate American imperialism and sort of just say, oh, no, it's just the regime is just, you know, it is just inherently corrupt, which obviously there is obviously very widespread corruption. But we have to understand how sanctions has interacted with this sort of domestic political economy within Iran and entrenched, you know, both a kind of predatory oligarchy, which has become stronger and stronger and stronger through its access to black markets, through smuggling networks, preferential currency rates, and so on and so forth. And you know, it's deepened the kind of authoritarianism in many ways. And again, we've seen the Islamic Republic itself has summoned time and again external aggressors and internal enemies in order to basically to crack down and consolidate itself and hold, you know, and tighten its grip and strangulation on power at home, which just goes to show that neither the Islamic Republic has, you know, its own people's interests at heart and really is the biggest threat to the Iranian people and their interests. And of course, American imperialism has zero interest to advance the well-being and common good of the Iranian people. And we've seen time and again, you know, since 1953, supporting the Shah, so on and so forth. Every time it has shown itself to be an adversary and an enemy of like genuine self-determination for Iranian people. And I think like we can never lose sight of this, and we have to really, you know, acknowledge this and think it through in a serious way.
I have nothing to add to what Afshin and Iskandar say very eloquently. In my own mind, I was thinking that what we're witnessing is a perfect storm, the condition of a perfect storm of four kinds of fascism. First and foremost is the Islamist fascism of ruling regime in Iran that has consistently eliminated all possibilities of internal reform, even by peoples like Khatami and Mousavi and such, which are their own people, and has consistently become that the boy who cried wolf. Anybody who said anything, they say, oh, this is Israel, this is United States. That when it was actually Israel, nobody believed them. Whatever the number of casualties in the most recent uprising, every single one of them, the responsibility is with the ruling regime, either by commission or by omission. Either they did it or they fail to protect the population from infiltration. They are singularly responsible for every single death that has happened. The endemic crisis of the Islamic Republic is the fact that it is not a democratic institution, that it just has this solitary figure of Wali Faqih sitting on top of this apparatus, and then these corrupt, incompetent rulers of one branch of government or another. And right now, in my opinion, for years, the ruling regime is under the control of the military. This is a military junta that is appearing, and the net result of this current condition would be even more naked military junta on the model of Pakistan or Egypt that awaits. So that's the first and foremost. Second is the rise of an astonishingly fascistic element, mostly internet-based, of the Pahlavi. Pahlavism itself has resurrected as a kind of fascism in the history of when the Shah returned to Iran after the coup of 1953. We have a thug. His name is Shaban Bimokh, Shaban the Brainless. You have the grandchildren of that Shaban the Brainless right now infesting the internet with the most vulgar attacks and the most vulgar presence that they intimidate anybody that comes near them and raising the flag of Israel, etc. So that's second. The third is, of course, Zionism. Afshin said that for whatever reason, the whatever reason is distraction from Palestine. not just the most recent case of genocide in Gaza. Israel's business is to distract attention from gobbling up the entirety of Palestine, and always by attacking dysfunctional states like Lebanon or Syria or Yemen. Or this, Israel did not create these dysfunctional government, but is taking advantage of this dysfunctional government. The same is with Iran. So the more you project the issue, right now, this one reason that these numbers of these casualties are keep being exaggerated is in order to compensate the actual number of Palestinians slaughtered by Israel. The fourth fascism, of course, is our own fascism. Look at what is happening in the United States. Look at what is happening in Minneapolis. Look at what happened in militarized police in Ferguson, etc. Look at the imperial presidency of this man who says in an interview with New York Times, nobody controls me, only my own conscience prevents me. So you have the perfect condition of perfect storm of four kinds of fascism, but at stake is the life of 90 million plus human beings that have done everything in their power, have always come to the streets with song and dance and joy and pleading for the most significant one was, where is my vote? What part of that is a threat or anything? Holding accountability during the Green Movement with Mousavi, or Zan Zindagi Azadi. When it happened, you have had one of the most glorious women-led uprising for their rights, for their human rights, for their women's rights, for their basic civil rights. What did the Islamic Republic did with them? It slaughtered them, shot them in their eyes, etc. Nothing that is happening, coming the way of Islamic Republic is unfair, is perfectly fair, and it deserves every hardship that it has. The problem is that Islamic Republic is in entirety is like a fly sitting on the face of a nation. Anytime you shoot at it, you shoot at the face of that nation. This is the paradox that now we face inside Iran. But like Afshin and Iskandar, I share their anxiety. Every day we get up in the morning, they may have started bombing. And there is anything, in my opinion, Israel has one objective, which is the disintegration of Iran into various fragments. Now, you can blame the Kurdish Iranians or the Azeri Iranians or the Arab Iranians because they have perfectly legitimate grievances against the central government. My own province, Khuzestan, which is the oil-rich part, it is devastated. Sistan and Baluchistan's rate of poverty, infant mortality rate, life expectancy is worse than anywhere in the world. And they are incapable, they're incompetent, they're corrupt to attend any one of this. So if I am a Baluchi, every right I give the Baluchi to be a separatist. I don't blame them. But will that be a solution for what we're facing today? I don't think so.
Well, maybe we should end there.
Should we give the last word to Afshin, maybe? Like,
Sure.
Actually, give us a bit of a hopeful note, you know?
Well, I don't know if it's hopeful or not, but after this, I'm going to go to downtown Los Angeles in 80-degree temperature and, so protest and
Rub it
support
in.
in Minnesota and maybe take my no war in Iran sign. But more seriously, I think there's not much that people like us can do. And I don't just mean people on the left. I think there's a consensus on the saner side of definitely in Iran, but also in the crazy Iranian diaspora. Most people are not monarchists. Most people do not support a U.S.-Israeli intervention. Most people do not even support sanctions on Iran. And what we can put out there is that, no, I mean, positive change in Iran is not going to come through any kind of foreign military intervention. Sanctions are aimed at the war against the people of Iran. Any kind of change that needs to come, if it's possible, has to be internally generated. Even Trump has said that. And we have to look at the people of Iran in their various kind of manifestations, trade unionists, women's organizations, these striking pensioners, ordinary people on the street, intellectuals, filmmakers, artists. None of them really ask for foreign intervention. They're all asking the regime to relent, to accept some responsibility for this predicament we're stuck in. There's no easy way out, but the answer is not going to come from outside.
Agreed. I think we can all agree on that. Well, again, wherever you guys are watching or listening to the show, there's a link in the description to Ashton's book, Axis of Empire, Excander. Again, thank you so much for putting this all together.
No, pleasure.
No.
Thank
It
you.
means
Thank
a lot.
you, Dave, for
honor.
giving the opportunity. It was an honor. And thank you, Hamid and Iskandar, John, for being here.
My pleasure. My pleasure. It's kind of good
No.
seeing you.
Yeah, great
This
to
is
see
this
you.
is a difficult.
Actually,
This
stay
is
in touch.
this
I'd
is-
love
this
to.
is a
Yes,
difficult
we'll
history
talk
to-
to you soon.
This is a difficult history to unpack, and I'm glad I had you guys here to unpack it with me. And I hope people check out the book because it'll give you a more in-depth understanding. Thank you so much. Again, thank you, everybody. Thank you,
You
Ashton,
guys.
for writing the book. And we
Thank you.
are